Welcome to the Wisdom of Grief podcast, where we talk about all things grief, always with the goal of restoring from loss and rediscovering joy. I'm Leslie Palumbo, and we're going to be talking today about the rule for self-protection in grief. I'm trying to keep these podcasts to about 10 minutes because, in general, we don't want to swirl around too long in these difficult areas. We have a wound and we don't want to pick at the wound. We want to nurture recovery, which brings me to my point and subject for today. Today, we're exploring loss as a wound and grief as the recovery process. So, just like a physical wound requires protection and care to heal, so does loss. I'm going to share practical ways to create an ideal healing environment, including the one powerful guideline that can help you navigate every decision and interaction during this time. So, the goal is to safeguard your healing and make this challenging process as smooth as possible. So, let's start with the difference between loss and grief. Loss is a wound and grief is a healing process. So loss isn't just emotional, too. It's a deep psychological and physical wound. I think of loss as a huge, gigantic, all-encompassing heart wound. I mean, think about all that loss includes, like some of the symptoms: exhaustion, overwhelm, physical pain, separation anxiety, that wrenching feeling of having lost somebody you love, hypersensitivity to everything, uh, confusion, yearning, nostalgia. I mean, the total loss of who you are now. Like, we lose who we were when we were with the person, and then we also lose the reflection of how they saw us. So there's a lot of identity stuff going on. Um, so much apprehension about the future, so much anguish. The wound has a lot of symptoms, way more than a broken leg or even major surgery. I was thinking my husband last year went through major surgery and they removed part of a major organ. And the first step of healing was just this acknowledgement, this imperative to recognize the new vulnerability and to create appropriate limits for healing. So it's really step one is acknowledging the landscape, that we have a very, very deep wound and that we are in a recovery process. The recovery process is grief. Grief is the process by which a mind, body, and spirit heals itself from the wound of loss. So, like other healing processes, grief needs its healing time and it requires our cooperation. So, if we do, for example, break our leg, it doesn't serve us to refuse to wear a cast, to walk on it before the bones have knit back together. And it's like this with grief. And it was like this with my husband's surgery, right? The first 8 weeks were really about attending with complete devotion to what the body needed, the new limits, what caused more pain, what caused less pain. And if he had, for example, refused to take his medication, refused, you know, the whole thing, just kind of negated the whole thing, been frustrated by it, it would have impeded his recovery. It's like this with grief. Patience is really integral to our recovery, and we need to trust the process that we will be restored. And healing is not about fighting grief, but trusting the process and moving with it. And where we get stuck in grief is always where we stop moving with the experience and begin fighting or questioning the sense of it. So I know we have a lot of resistance in grief where it's just, why did this happen? This shouldn't have happened. I want to go back to the way it was before. And I think about that with regard to my husband. If he would have said, I want to go back to having my full organ, I want to go back to what I could do before, I do not want to be here. And I know part of us always has to kind of step through that threshold that it's so, so hard and we just don't want to be there. But as we, part of it is just learning with devotion about this new landscape, acknowledging the landscape, and even acknowledging how difficult it is. I think about grief. We never want an injury. We never want the loss. We never want a physical injury. And we have to acknowledge about the grief that it is so unwanted. Like it's the worst thing. I think of it as like this mandatory 24/7 job that was thrust upon us. And it's the job we never would have wanted or chosen, but like we have to do it. So just acknowledging that is also a piece of, moving to the next step, which really is learning all about learning all about the landscape, like where we are now. And for us, the landscape is a wilderness, like it's brand new in the early phases. And it's going to involve new rules. It's changing everything, right? Our limits are different. Our pain tolerance is different. Our energy level is different. And we have to study this attentively. When I think about my husband's surgery, the first 8 weeks were literally, what do I need now? What is my pain tolerance? What helps me get through the day? What does not help me get through the day? And I think with grief, the central question is, this is the one guideline that can always answer any question that you have is, does it feed me or does it deplete me? In other words, does it bring pain to the wound or does it bring relief? And everything in early grief is about feeding you, nurturing you, bringing relief. And it's to be avoided if it depletes you and brings more pain because you're already way low. Think of all the symptoms. Think of the intensity of this enormous heart wound. So, the simple guideline, does it feed me or does it deplete me? And so many of my clients say, you always say that. I've heard you say that. And I'm saying it again because it helps you identify what supports your healing and what doesn't. And it's going to be different for each one of us because for me, I may want to talk about it and that may make me feel better and bring ease and relief to my grief wound. But for other people, talking about it is an offense and it feels like stabbing at the wound. So it's different for each one of us, but the question is the same. And so, like, let's try to apply that to, I don't know, some things that we would say we want to avoid during grief. There are a couple of things we would try to avoid, and the answer of how much to avoid and how little to avoid these things, what is our tolerance for these things, is going to be different for each one of us. So, the first one is toxic interactions. We think about limiting our exposure to unhelpful people or overwhelming environments. Some people say that we are all empaths in grief, meaning we have less tolerance and we have more sensitivity to negativity, crowds, um, noise, high degrees of noise, because we're kind of in a traumatic loss period, or anything that sort of forces us to have to hide our secret pain and um, put a mask on because it's hard to put a mask on. You could put a Band-Aid on the wound, but sometimes the Band-Aid bleeds through. And for each person, it's different. How quickly does the Band-Aid bleed through? So the question is for you is it depleting me or is it feeding me? And you ask yourself going into, if you're going into a big crowd, to a big event, um, you ask that question. If you're going out in public, you ask that question. Is the Band-Aid enough? Is it going to feed me or is it going to deplete me? How much is it going to deplete me? I cannot afford to be depleted any further. Another thing we want to try and avoid to protect the healing environment is overcommitment. So, learning to say no to activities or demands that drain your limited energy. How do we know? We ask the question, will it feed me or will it deplete me? When I picture myself in that environment, do I have the energy or do I not? Some things we want to commit to because we know they are going to nurture our heart, and some things do not. And then the other thing we want to avoid in early grief, and again, depending upon the answer to the question, you'll know how much or how little, that's neglecting your needs. Like anything that neglects your personal needs, overworking, numbing behaviors, anything that is too much of that is going to create a buildup of grief. So again, answer that question for yourself. Um, and then the second part of that is, what do we engage with to nurture recovery? And we want to focus on three things there too. We want to focus on supportive relationships. And again, the question is, knowing what relationships are supportive to you may be different in this new landscape. They may be different. We're spending the first 8 weeks, we're spending the first bit of time really getting to know that landscape. Like, what works for me now, what doesn't work for me. It may be different during this intense time. So people who respect your grief and offer kindness without judgment is kind of a rule of thumb. Some people want to be around people who just quietly respect your grief and don't talk about it. And some people want to be with people who talk about it. And you will know that limit by asking yourself the question, does it cause more pain, or does it does it bring relief? Um, you also, general rule of thumb, is grounding activities. That's what to bring nurturing, what to engage with, activities that provide kind of structure, like journaling, walking, meditation, things that are in sync with nature, because you're in a natural process of the immune system recovery. Like, it is part of nature. So it has the similar rhythms. So things that are um, in tune with nature tend to bring more calm and more peace, and things that are more about like the linear day to day, hurried workaday world tend to bring raise stress levels and grief. Um, and the other thing to engage with is in terms of nurturing recovery, and you'll know how much or how little by answering the question, is self compassion practices. And that's just allowing space for rest, self care, and forgiveness during difficult moments. Does it feed me, or does it deplete me? Does it nourish me, or does it make me feel more anxious, more stressed? Does it heighten my symptoms? And, just that whole idea of creating and communicating your boundaries is going to be determined by listening to that inner guide, by asking that question to yourself gently over and over, tuning into what feels right or wrong for your emotional state. And sometimes that involves like practicing saying no in new ways. Sometimes we're not great at saying no, and just creating the words in advance, creating the script in advance. And we're going to do another podcast on this, like um, self protective conversation, like literally statements you can use. But it's just even things we may not normally say, like, I need some space right now, or I'm just going to pass this time around. Or sometimes people feel like they have to create their own way of saying it, that because they feel too vulnerable to say, like, they may feel weak, like, I'm in grief. Maybe you'll feel weak because you don't have the same limits. So you might just want to say to yourself, I can't, I've got a headache. Like, sometimes you want to say that because it's a way of gracefully declining that feels best to you. And the other piece is just how to take the eyes off of you when the eyes are on you too much. And that's that art of protective conversation, which is, um, my cousin once said it to me, and it was said so beautifully. If you want to take the eyes off you in the conversation, you just lob the ball back. She used the tennis reference, which was sort of like, just hit it back to them. Ask a question about the other person. That takes the focus off you and brings it back to them. And that way you're sort of learning to steer a conversation to protect yourself. And then just finally acknowledging that, like, as you heal, your needs are going to evolve, and give yourself permission to revisit and adjust your boundaries over time. Continue to ask that one question. That one question is your best friend. So, just to conclude, in our little 10 minutes of grief today, loss is a wound, and grief is its recovery. And by respecting this process and applying the cardinal rule, does it feed me or does it deplete me? You create the conditions for healing. You support the conditions for grief as a healing process. And boundaries in grief are not selfish, they're just an act of self respect and compassion. And I think it takes a lot of courage to prioritize your healing. And every step you take towards self care transforms how you experience the world and will moving forward. So, in closing, I would like to give you our quote for the day. And this one is by Pema Chodron. And it says, "What you do for yourself, any gesture of kindness, any gesture of honesty and clear seeing toward yourself, will affect how you experience your world. In fact, it will transform how you experience the world. What you do for yourself, you do for others, and what you do for others, you do for yourself." So live with that, see how it lands for you. And until next time, I wish you peace as you tread the waters of grief.